Okay, hello everyone. I'm Alex Jr. I lead marketing for Elode USA, and today I'm going to be talking about what makes a biosolids dryer practical and efficient. So to level set, pretty much what dryers do is they remove the water content from your biosolids in order to improve things like your disposal costs, as well as the stability, handling, and even compliance of your biosolids. Now the issue today is that most dryers are too expensive for most wastewater treatment plants. Why? Well, they require lots of additional equipment, right? You need things like boilers and furnaces, heat exchangers, dust separators, etc. And you also need a large enough building to house all of that equipment. Now, those upfront costs alone are usually enough to scare most wastewater treatment plants away from adopting dryers, but there's more. You also have to consider your ongoing costs, right? Because each component that you have as part of an overall system means that you have more maintenance and downtime to consider. But most notably, what these dryers do is essentially they boil the water in the sludge into steam. And it turns out that's a really energy inefficient and energy intensive process. Because heating water from 0 to 99 degrees Celsius is one thing, but when you're trying to boil it at 100 degrees Celsius, which is just a 1 degree difference, you need to consume 4.5 times more energy. And so the key insight here is that if you can avoid boiling water to steam, then you end up with a much more energy efficient dryer. And it's not just about your energy savings, you also end up creating fewer byproducts, like steam, heat, odor, and dust. And because you don't have as many byproducts that you need to process, you can get away with using a lot less equipment. So much so that it reduces the cost of purchasing and also operating a drying system. And so essentially, if you can avoid boiling water to steam, you have a practical and efficient dryer that can serve more wastewater treatment plants here in America. So that's what we're doing at Elode USA. So this is our Elode machine. It stands for the electro-osmosis dehydrator. And rather than boiling the water into steam, what Elode does is it essentially electrocutes your biosolids, instantly separating the water from the solids in a super fast and efficient process. And so here's our first installation in the US. It's at Henderson, Kentucky. Pretty much the water utility there, they received a phone call from their local landfill saying, hey, starting from today, we're not going to accept any more of your biosolids, so good luck finding someone else. And so all of a sudden, they're scrambling to find a solution, right? Reaching out to all these different drying system vendors. And ultimately, they decided upon the Elode. And I'll dive into why in a second, but first, just take a look at that picture. The Elode there is up front and center, okay? And that's the biggest unit that we sell. It's about the size of a minivan. And in terms of the accessories that are required, sure, on top there's some ductwork to help exhaust some of the vapors that are created during the process. And you also have a water tank, a water pump, and a drain for cleaning some of the components during the drying cycle. And then on the left, you also have conveyors that take out the dried biosolids out, in their case, to the dumpster, which is right on the other side of that wall. And so how does Elode work? Well, first it's fed in dewatered biosolids. So in Henderson's case, what they're doing is they're belt pressing their sludge, but you could use a centrifuge, screw press, fan press, plate press, doesn't matter. After that, the biosolids then roll into the dehydration zone, which is where the electroosmosis occurs. And then finally, the cake is discharged out into the conveyors for disposal at a landfill. Now, what I want to highlight about this process is that it's continuous and it only takes 3 minutes, okay? So that's 1 minute for feeding, 1 minute for dehydrating, and another minute for discharging. And the operators, all they need to do is press the auto start button, and within 5 minutes, the Elode's already drying their biosolids, okay? Compare that to a thermal drying system that takes hours to heat up, and hours to process the sludge, and then hours to cool down, right? And just note like the overall footprint of the dryer, right? I mean, a competitive thermal dryer would probably take up the size of the entire room there, but here they have space for 2 Elodes, and I'll dive into that in a second, but why don't we take a look about how Elode looks in action. So That was the biosolids getting fed into the Elode, and here it is in the dehydration zone. And here's the electroosmosis in action. So pretty much you can see the water is instantly separating out of the solids and through the filter belt. And remember, that's all water that you don't have to boil into steam. That's why Elode's able to get away with such a small footprint and not require so many additional components. That's what the dried cake looks like exiting the machine. And in Henderson's case, before Elode, that sludge cake enters at 14% solids, and by the time it hits the dumpster after Elode, it's at 42% solids, meaning that their cake weight is reduced down to 1/3 of its original weight after Elode. So what does Henderson think about this? Well, the superintendent says, it really does reduce our solids by 60% in 3 minutes. This could be a game changer for our industry. The director of operations says, we're glad we bought the Elode. It's even more valuable because it gives us goodwill with our new landfill. They love our sludge. It's a slam dunk decision. And finally, the general manager simply says, we're saving so much money with this machine. Now there is a catch, and the catch is that Elode cannot dry up to 90% solids. In fact, for municipal wastewater biosolids, it's typically capped out around 50% solids. And the reason behind that is because the sludge starts to act more like an insulator rather than a conductor, and obviously that's not really conducive to a process that requires electricity to flow, right? But what you need to consider is that if you're starting at 15% solids and you're going to 50% solids, you're reducing the weight of those biosolids by 70%. To get to 90% solids, you're only going to eke out an additional 13% cake weight reduction. And so what you need to ask yourself is that additional 13% weight reduction worth having to boil that water into steam and purchase all that equipment, house it in a big-ass room, maintain it, and obviously expend all the energy costs associated with such a thermal dryer, right? Now that being said, the two technologies are also complementary, right? You can always feed Elode dried cake into a thermal dryer to achieve whatever target percent DS you want in the most efficient way possible. And so to wrap things up, what makes a practical and efficient biosolids dryer? It's one that doesn't have to boil water into steam, like Elode, right? Elode's able to use the least amount of energy possible, only 1/3 compared to conventional thermal dryers. It also creates way fewer byproducts like steam, heat, and odor, but most notably, there's no dust generated in this process, meaning you don't need that dust separation and collection equipment, nor do you have to worry about the explosion hazards associated with dust. Finally, like I've been mentioning this whole presentation, it's a really small stock unit that doesn't require a bunch of accessories. And that way, by avoiding boiling water to steam, Elode is a really practical and efficient biosolids dryer that's much more feasible for more wastewater treatment plants in America to use. And so here's a little bit about our company history. A few things that I want to point out here is that this year we'll be installing 2 more units out in Wisconsin, and Henderson, Kentucky also loves the unit so much they're going to be purchasing another. And yeah, we're always testing customer sludge. You know, we have our 2 trailer-mounted units out in New Jersey, so you can send us a few 5-gallon buckets, and we can test it at any time. Just reach out to my email, alexjr@elodeusa.com. And yeah, we're happy to test your sludge, but if you also prefer something on-site, we can always bring our trailer-mounted unit to you, so you can see it in action and learn a bit more about how the system works. But yeah, that pretty much wraps up our presentation. I'll open it up for Q&A, and yeah.